And he headed out the front door onto the road. And as soon as Samuel was outside, he immediately heard this loud commotion happening right down the street. And he turned and looked in the direction, and he saw this kind of gaggle of people and cars sort of standing in what looked like a big circle around whatever was happening over there. Samuel couldn't tell what it was, but people were honking and people had their phones out filming sort of whatever was in the middle of the circle. And from the looks of it, it appeared there was at least one police officer in his car sort of beginning to marshal the scene and block traffic. But, there was just this chaotic scene happening, and Samuel really had no idea what it was. But naturally, being a human, he was interested. He wanted to see what was going on. And so Samuel began walking down the road, and as he did, he pulled out his phone, opened up his camera, and began filming and taking pictures. And as he got closer to whatever was going on here, the cacophony of horns and people yelling and all the chaos just got louder and louder, and it still wasn't clear at all to Samuel what the heck this even was. And so he just continued to take photos and just kind of be an onlooker. And at some point, when Samuel got right up close and actually was standing right near that police officer blocking traffic, he happened to turn his phone and aim his camera at the police officer. And when he did, he took a photo. Here is the photo he took. As you can see, the police officer is aiming his gun directly at Samuel. And that's because this is not a police officer. Samuel just thought he was a police officer. When he looked down the road at this crazy scene, he saw this guy in a car who sort of appeared to be, maybe an undercover cop, sort of, in the right place at the right time, taking charge and handling whatever this was. When in reality, this man who's in this photo is a guy named Jeffrey Hammond, who had just been involved in a road rage incident, and he shot and killed a 47-year-old man named Ryan Martin. That was the scene that Samuel had walked out to. Jeffrey Hammond shooting and killing Ryan Martin. That's what everybody was reacting to. And so as Samuel walked down the road, not knowing that, he inadvertently stood right in front of the shooter, who was still sort of crazed, aimed his camera at him right as Jeffrey Hammond swung his gun around and shot Samuel. So literally seconds after this photo was taken, Samuel got shot. Luckily though, Samuel would survive the shooting. As for Jeffrey Hammond, he was arrested and charged with murder, and as far as we know, he is currently in jail awaiting trial. On April 5th, 2018, a young man named Luis Hernandez sat inside of a small stone shack with a metal roof on a rural property in northern Venezuela. Luis was a painter, and for the last year or so, this shack had doubled as both his home and his art studio. And it was basically always a mess. There was dirty dishes and food everywhere, and all his paint supplies were scattered all over the ground. But the walls were all adorned with all of his beautiful and most prized possessions, his artwork. He mainly painted really dramatic-looking portraits in very bold colors. In fact, when he was actually doing his painting, when he was in the middle of the floor, right in the center of his shack, on one wall, there was this face of a man he had done, all in red, and then on the left, on the other wall, was this woman's face, all in blue, but with bright red lips. And these paintings were both so intense that at times, as he was doing his work, it sort of felt like they were both looking at him. But on this particular day, as Luis sat in the middle of his shack working on his latest project, he put that weird thought out of his mind that, his paintings were watching him, and just focused instead on getting this done. He had one more beautiful portrait he was working on, and he took his paintbrush and he dipped it in the black ink, and he put the finishing touches on it. And when this portrait was done, Luis kind of sat back and took it all in, and he couldn't help but feel a bit emotional. Because this project, it was different than any other he had ever done. He wasn't doing it for fun, he wasn't doing it for pay. He was doing it as a way to cope with a big crisis in his life. So this shack where Luis worked and lived, and also the rural property that it sat on, belonged to Luis's boyfriend, Lisandro Rosales Garcia. Lisandro and Luis had met about a year earlier when Luis was really down on his luck and was actually homeless, living out on the streets. But Lisandro had seen Luis and offered to let him come live in this shack on his property, which was out in the middle of nowhere. And Luis, who's got no other options, is like, awesome, yes, I'd love to do that. And so he moves out into the shack, and pretty quickly after moving in, Luis and Lisandro, they formed a more romantic relationship, and Luis was so happy. He felt like Lisandro was the one person who really understood him and truly supported his art. But then, about 2 months ago, Lisandro had just gone missing. The police were looking into it, but so far, Luis had not gotten any updates. And so Luis was handling this huge gap in his life now, the only way he knew how to, which was with his art. And so this latest project he had just finished was sort of like a tribute to his missing boyfriend. But as Luis put his brush down and stood up to admire his work, he suddenly heard voices from outside. Now, this was highly unusual because this property really was very remote. I mean, the only time Luis or Lisandro would see people here was if they invited them, and Luis had not invited anyone. But before Luis could even react to, these strangers on his property, those people outside began pounding on Luis's front door. And so Luis, he opened up the door, and standing there were all these police officers. And Luis's first reaction was, oh, they must be here to give me some updates about Lisandro's disappearance. But these police officers, they didn't give an update. Instead, they just pushed past Luis into the art studio and began scooping up all his paints and paintbrushes. And then at some point, one of the officers actually looked down and saw the final project that Luis had been working on, his tribute to his missing boyfriend. And when the officer saw that painting, he turned around, ran outside, and vomited. Here is a picture of that tribute. Now, at first glance, this piece of art is totally unremarkable. It appears to be some sort of stained glass with green leaves and some blue and red flowers. But when you consider the types of supplies that Luis used to make this particular piece of art, you'll realize how horrifying this image actually is, and it's what caused that officer to vomit. It would turn out Luis was not just a painter. He was also a serial killer. And what he would do is after he killed his victims, he would use their blood, their ashes, and their other body parts to paint all of his paintings. Now, at first, Luis and Lisandro were actually a happy couple. However, at some point in February of 2018, they got into some kind of fight, and Luis killed Lisandro and quickly began using his body parts to create this tribute to his boyfriend. If you look again at the tribute painting, all the red that is used is Lisandro's blood, and all the black that's used is Lisandro's ashes. All told, police would find the remains of at least 6 people on that property. They also found evidence that Luis was not just using their body parts to make art, he was also cannibalizing his victims. Luis was arrested and made a full confession. As far as we know, he is currently incarcerated in Venezuela.